So I'm really excited to be here. Um, so here's what I want to do with our time here today. My goal is to take, we've had these flood of executive actions. It feels like what's happening in Washington and federal actions have dominated the news. That's probably an understatement. My goal is to try to take some of that and put it in context for the effect here in Minnesota and what that means. And so I'm going to talk through that federal landscape, and I'm going to try to pull apart, where are these federal actions, these executive orders actually meaningful, and where are they, a lot of bluster and fear that doesn't have meaningful legal impact, because I'm a lawyer, so that's how my brain works. And how do we separate that from the rhetoric? And then I'll talk through a little bit how it affects individual mines that are the proposals here on the ground in Minnesota, with a focus on sulfide mining. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit more about who MCEA is at the beginning here. A lot of you know, a lot of you have in fact been supporters of MCEA for a long time, for which I'm very grateful. But as Chuck mentioned, MCEA is a public interest environmental law firm. We're a nonprofit. And so Minnesota is blessed with many environmental organizations, which is wonderful. And they're organized in different ways. So some of them will protect a place, like the boundary waters. Some of them may work on a specific medium, like clean energy or clean water. And what MCEA does is we plug in wherever lawyers are helpful and needed in the environmental movement. So we work on clean water and agriculture. We work on clean energy and climate. We work on environmental justice in communities around Minneapolis, for example, that are experiencing high levels of pollution. And we work on sulfide mining. And so as an organization, we kind of hit the full range of environmental issues when groups come to us and say, hey, what we really need right now is a lawyer. And that's what we're there for. And so a lot of our work over the past 50 years has been on sulfide mining. And people will sometimes ask me, why are we spending time on sulfide mining above other issues, right? We've got other environmental challenges here in Minnesota. That's not the only one. I'm going to get my clicker. And a lot of you, I think, probably could answer this question as well as I could, to be honest, because you live with these issues. However, there might be some new folks in the room, and I'm just going to get us all in the same place as to why we care about sulfide mining as an issue. All right, so this is a picture of some acid mine drainage that has taken place actually pretty close to here, about 10 miles. This is the Spruce Road site. And of course, we've had taconite mining in Minnesota for many years. Taconite mining has its own issues, for sure, but sulfide mining is different as an industry. And that's because of this risk of acid mine drainage. There's a higher potential for pollution, and particularly this acidic pollution from the sulfide mining sites. In addition, sulfide mining as an industry has an unbroken record of pollution. We don't have examples of mines that have operated and closed safely without causing pollution in the sulfide mine industry. And the pollution lasts for hundreds of years. And so, if you go out west, you can see sites, for example, around Butte, Montana, where the mining took place decades or even centuries ago, and the pollution persists. There really isn't, at this point, a strategy for closing down these mines and making sure that they don't continue to pollute for decades or centuries. And typically, the local jurisdiction is left holding the bag. So as Minnesota taxpayers, it's highly likely that we would end up bearing the cost of that cleanup. Or that, in some jurisdictions, of course, they can't clean it up at all. So the cost is, thousands of years or hundreds of years of pollution. And so we don't have any sulfide mines in Minnesota. And so this is a new threat, and there are proposals to build them. And that's why we focus on it as an organization. Oh, hello. What's happening? Did I break it? Okay. Lacey's going to fix that while I talk. All right. So thinking about the federal and state landscape, there are 3 takeaways that I want you to have from this talk. And this is like an old orator's trick, right? You tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them and told them what you told them. So I'm going to say it at the beginning and the end, and then you'll all remember my 3 points. The first one is to remember that Minnesota gets to decide about sulfide mining. The federal government cannot permit a mine on its own in Minnesota. We have state laws, and we get to decide when and how our minerals operate. And I want that to be a takeaway for you all, because in the coming months, my guess is a lot of you are involved with organizations, including MCEA, who may call upon you and ask you to, for example, call up your legislator, or call up the governor, or call up a state agency. And I will tell you that really matters, because these are the folks who are going to be most important in deciding whether we have sulfide mining in the coming years. The second thing I want you to be able to do at the end of this talk is to recognize political rhetoric. There's a lot of things that we hear from mining companies about why we need to mine. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit and help you understand how much that's affected by political wins rather than real durable beliefs of advocates. The third thing is to understand the limits of federal power. Absolutely, there are things the federal government can do. These executive orders do have the force of law, and I don't want to diminish that, but there are limits into which that can reach into Minnesota and the effects here, and I'm going to delve into that and help you understand that as well. Okay, I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to try this. Yay, okay. Don't spend a lot of energy reading this slide. The goal here is to make you feel what, frankly, a lot of us are probably feeling already, which is a certain amount of overwhelm by the flood of federal actions that have already taken place in the first 6 months of this administration. So what this is a list of executive orders that are relevant to the issue of sulfide mining. They're relevant to many other things as well, but they do have specific applicability to sulfide mining as an issue in Minnesota. So I'm going to talk through a little bit what these are and what the sort of overall takeaway from these various executive orders is. Okay, so on Inauguration Day, Trump signed 2 executive orders, unleashing American energy and declaring a national energy emergency. These 2 executive orders ordered agencies to review any regulations that might slow down energy, domestic energy exploration and supply, including critical minerals. It ordered agencies to look at revoking all federal rules that were passed under our National Environmental Review Law. So we have a statute, and there's a lot of rules under NEPA, looked at repealing all of those rules. It repeals a bunch of Biden-era executive orders on climate change, orders prioritization of mining on federal lands, and also requires agencies to identify and speed up any permitting processes, including Clean Water Act or endangered species processes, to make all of that happen as quickly as possible. You might be thinking, what is that? This is about mining. What exactly is the energy connection? I actually don't really fully get that, to be honest. This is primarily aimed at oil and gas development, but mining is listed as one of the critical industries in each of these executive orders, even though the relationship to energy is a little bit more attenuated. On February 14th, he established the National Energy Dominance Council. You can't make these names up. This will advise the president on how to establish American energy dominance, including in mining. On March 20th, immediate measures to increase American mineral production. So now we're getting into a very direct connection to mining. And the overall message from this one is that national security is threatened when we don't have a domestic mining industry. The language in here said, it is imperative for our national security that the United States take immediate action to facilitate domestic mineral production to the maximum extent possible, and prioritizes mineral development on federal land. On April 15th, I'm not going to read the whole title, but there was another executive order around mineral production that listed that critical minerals are key to our national security and ordered investigation of other markets engaged in predatory practices to undercut our domestic mineral markets. On May 2nd, he added 10 critical mineral production projects to a federal permitting dashboard intended to fast track mines, and that include the Polymet mine, which now goes by the term New Range, but just for clarity, because I'm talking about history as well, I'm just going to refer to as Polymet for the rest of today. And on May 23rd, the Bureau of Land Management issued some guidance that said that we should take environmental impact statements, which typically take at least a year, often more, in a complicated or controversial project, and that we should do those in 28 days. Yes. And the quote from that from our Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum, was that the United States cannot afford to wait. We are cutting through unnecessary delays to fast track the development of American energy and critical minerals, resources that are essential to our economy, our military readiness, and our global competitiveness. That's language from the press release of the BLM statement. Okay, so that's a lot. What are the themes that we can take away from this? There's a few things. The first one is the Trump administration is going heavy onto the national security theme. They're saying this is about having the minerals we need for our military and military readiness, and that this is important for national security. The overall goal of these is to streamline permitting and support the industry. And then we have this fast tracking of specific projects. That's kind of those are the main things I want you to sort of remember from these various executive orders. Okay, so where does this leave us? This administration benefits from the overwhelm that people feel when they see things like this, right? It comes fast and furious, and has for the last 6 months, and makes it hard. It's almost as if every time something new happens, it passes so quickly that we don't even have time to really process or understand it before then we're on to the next thing, right? It's a flood. It's literally, and some people have referred to it as this way, it's a flood the zone strategy. Basically make people feel overwhelmed and become paralyzed. That's part of the goal here. And there's sociologists that talk about this. And so they benefit from that effect, and they benefit from the lack of clarity around the actual legal impact of these various actions. If it's not clear and people are afraid, that benefits this administration. And we're seeing new levels of executive overreach. So we're seeing efforts to expand the power of the president and the executive branch at the expense of the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And so when it's not clear who holds the power, the president benefits. And so the role of nonprofits, I believe, and the role of lawyers like myself in moments like this is to disentangle what is in fact meaningful legal authority and what is in fact bluster and fear. To make sure that we understand what our own rights are, and to make sure that we don't pre-comply out of uncertainty or out of that fear. And so when I say that here in Minnesota, we still control our mineral resources, it's really important to disentangle that fear from the actual legal effect, because we still have a lot of legal rights, and whether or not a mine gets permitted is still within the authority of our state government. Okay, so I'm going to start with the actual legal effects of some of these actions. So notably, I mentioned that, and this is kind of the easy one, is that the Polymet mine was listed on May 2nd, I think it was, on a website of fast-tracked projects, right? These are the ones that we're going to fast-track. The legal effect of that, to be very clear, is zero. There is no federal permit that comes out of this. There are no rights that this mine is entitled to. There are no subsidies or access to any resources. It's literally just your name gets on a website. So let's be very clear. Fast tracking the Polymet mine in this way doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a name on a website. Now, let's talk about some of these efforts to strip out federal regulations and to speed things up. And this could be meaningful because the president does have the authority to strip out regulations. The president also, under certain circumstances, has the authority to declare an emergency, as he did on that January 20th one, and suspend the use of some regulations. And so that one's a maybe. There's a lot of litigation to happen between now and then. And notably, the National Emergency Executive Order, the one that tries to suspend application of Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act, the Minnesota Attorney General, along with I think 20 other attorney generals, has sued the Trump administration for suspension of that, alleging that in fact we do not have an energy emergency and that there's no basis for the president to declare an emergency and suspend some of these regulations, and has had some initial victories in court on that. So a lot of unknowns between now and then that have not been resolved. And what that means is that state law will become the primary safeguard that we have for now, because the president cannot suspend our state laws. I want to note as well, I want to talk for a moment about this 28-day EIS thing. So the Bureau of Land Management put out this guidance that said, an EIS for a critical mineral project can happen in 28 days. And an environmental impact statement, in many projects, it's about a year, and in other projects, it takes much longer. And in the case of Polymet, it took much longer. I started with MCEA in 2010, and the environmental review for that project had already started when I joined in 2010. And it had gone through a couple phases. And then a draft came out at the end of 2010. And the EPA said, this draft is not very good. You have to go do it again. And they did it again. And a new draft came out end of 2013 to 2014. And they didn't get their permit until 2018. So that was a, 16-year process, roughly. And that's not common. They had that setback of they made a pretty bad EIS, so the EPA told them to do it again. But also it was, it is the first proposed sulfide mine in Minnesota. And so you have the state agencies trying to figure out how to apply these laws that are specific to sulfide mining that they've never applied before. And so you've got the agencies trying to navigate new law. You've got a very complicated project. You've got a very controversial project, and you've got a first draft EIS that was poorly written, and all of that resulted in a very long project or a very long process. That's an outlier. Most of them go faster than that, but they can be quite lengthy. 28 days, a 28-day EIS, and I'll just be blunt about this, is a joke. That's not a real EIS document. This requires, an EIS requires studies. It requires multiple rounds of public comment. It's also often the only opportunity at which the government consults with tribal nations. It's likely to cut that out either partially or completely. It's just not going to be a useful document. And whatever's in there is probably going to be written entirely by the mining company who is proposing the mine. Because let's be clear about this as well. The other thing this administration is doing is firing a lot of staff, like expert career staff who do things like enforce our laws and read the environmental impact statements to decide if they're any good and whether the project is ready to proceed. So it's not even clear that there are folks at the federal government, honestly, who have the expertise or the time to read these EISs. So that 28-day EIS is useless. And so that would certainly end up in court. But the other problem that you have is you also have to do an environmental impact statement under state law. And this is where the limitations of federal power, I think, really become clear, because this is the choice that the mining company has. Either they can do these separately. So, okay, I'll go get my 28-day EIS at the federal level and get whatever federal permits I need, and then end up in court on that EIS, which is probably not very good and a judge may not be very impressed by. And then I still have to go through, whatever process is required, probably 2 to 5 years at least, at the state level. So you haven't gotten yourself out of the state EIS and you're stuck in court on your federal EIS. That's one option. The other option is to just do them together and say, you know what, we don't really want this 28-day EIS option because it doesn't get us anything. We still have to do the state EIS. So we're just going to put these back together and sort of ignore this Trump executive order that allows us to go faster. And that is frankly the path that mining companies have chosen in the past when there have been other executive orders to try to streamline this stuff. And that is what it seems like PolyMet is going to choose today. Like they have made statements to the press that they're not going to do this 28-day EIS. And that's because they see what I see, which is this doesn't get you very much. Mostly it lands you in court, and while you still have a long state process ahead of you. So that's the limitation of those efforts to try to streamline federal operations. The other part of this state law is, people know this, I think, but I'll just say it anyway, is that PolyMet was the first sulfide mine in Minnesota to get its permits in 2018. And MCEA, along with our partner groups, litigated that. And most of those permits were reversed or taken away from the mining company because they did not meet state law. And those court cases, it's not just that that mine hasn't been built, it's that that legal precedent, those court decisions, and almost all of those permits went all the way up to the Minnesota Supreme Court. So we have decisions from the highest court in Minnesota. Those decisions are precedent that apply to all future sulfide mining operations because they interpreted our laws governing sulfide mining for the first time. And so those are really important decisions that will continue to apply and help us keep our state law as a safeguard. Okay, so legal facts. Now let's talk a little bit about what are the risks of sort of the rhetoric and the bluster that we're hearing from the federal administration. I'm calling this social or pre-compliance effects. We see, so this issue of this administration benefiting from like fear or intimidation tactics is one that we've seen work time and time again in other sectors. And the one that's meaningful to me is in the law firms, right? So Trump, and I think people know this story, but I'll tell it from my perspective a little bit. Trump signed executive orders targeting multiple law firms because those law firms had represented clients that he didn't like. Maybe it was the Democratic National Committee, or maybe it was Clinton or the Biden campaign. He didn't like their clients, and so he signed these executive orders. And these executive orders were extreme. They said things like the lawyers who work at your firm, all of their security clearances are stripped such that they can't go to federal court anymore. Well, you can't be a very good lawyer if you can't walk into a courtroom, and so these were very punitive. And some law firms, actually some of them quite quickly, settled, right? They signed these deals with the Trump administration. They agreed to donate pro bono legal representation, and they agreed to, change language on their website around DEI or things like that. Actually, the terms of many of these agreements are not well defined. And so we don't know exactly what they agreed to, but the pro bono representation seems clear. Other law firms have decided to fight, and those law firms have had some success because these are pretty clearly unconstitutional orders. But those law firms that chose to settle, first of all, I will say I don't think that history will look kindly upon those law firms and their decision to do that, because the right of a lawyer to represent anyone they want is pretty fundamental to the legal process. And in case it's not obvious, if you have a court system where you have people with viable claims who cannot find a lawyer because people are too scared to represent that politically disfavored client, that court system doesn't work. Like, that's the end of an effective judiciary. And so this is a very fundamental right to legal practice. I know you may be thinking, like, boohoo for the big law firms, and I get that. But the reality is that this gets very fundamentally at the issue of a functioning court system. And so when I say that this administration benefits from pre-compliance, what I mean is that when people decide that they will give in rather than fight, that becomes a problem for our rights and our democracy overall. So what are we worried about here with mining? Well, the first thing is all of this rhetoric. It's important to keep in mind that the rhetoric around sulfide mining follows political winds. Do you all remember when there were sulfide mining companies telling us that we need to mine because we need to have minerals for electric vehicles and wind turbines and the clean energy transition? Remember that? Yeah, of course you do. It was only like 6 months ago, right? We're not hearing those arguments nearly as much anymore. Now what we hear is the language that was in these executive orders: national security, technology dominance. We're starting to hear companies invoke artificial intelligence as a reason to do mining because the big data centers they want to build require a lot of metals, right? And so we're seeing, like, it's important to recognize the through line here isn't, the through line here is what's politically salient at the moment, right? And so these mines are, the mining companies, they were never interested in clean energy, and they're not that interested in national security now either. They're repeating the rhetoric that feels most powerful at the moment. They're following those political winds. And that's the through line, right? Mining companies want to mine, and they will say whatever they think they need to say to move their project forward. And so that's something for all of us to just be aware of as we hear these arguments, is that that's their source, is whatever's happening politically. The second thing we need to be aware of is that mining companies will likely use these executive orders and the general perception that the federal government has approved of them, supports them, wants them to move forward, thinks they're important, to try to leverage the state to move faster. So we will hear arguments of mining companies saying, look, the Trump administration says we're important for national security. Who are you, Minnesota, to stand in our way, right? We'll hear those arguments. If they do receive federal approval for some of those federal permits, that's not enough for them to mine, but they might come to the state and say, hey, look, the federal government says we already complied with environmental laws. The federal government says that we've already met the legal standards. Why are you holding us up, state of Minnesota? So we will hear those arguments to start to try to leverage the weakening of state laws. And I'm calling that out now because I think it's helpful for all of us as residents to see that for what it is, which is an effort to use this rhetoric to try to lower state standards. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about how this affects or where each of our projects are at. So there's 3 projects, 3 sulfide mining proposals in Minnesota that are sort of furthest along and get talked about the most. And they're in this map. So Twin Metals, of course, is nearby. Probably everybody's familiar with that one. PolyMet, or New Range, is also actually quite close, but on the Lake Superior side. So you can kind of see the colors represent the watershed. You're able to see that. So we have the Twin Metals on the Boundary Waters watershed or Rainy River side. We have PolyMet just on the Lake Superior side. That's pretty close to the line, but it does, the water would flow towards Lake Superior. And then we have the Talon mine, which is a nickel proposal that's in the Mississippi River watershed. So now we have these proposals that are threatening 3 major watersheds here in Minnesota. And I'm gonna take Talon first. So Talon, as I mentioned, is primarily a nickel proposal. And I would say Talon's future is probably the murkiest of the 3 under the Trump administration. And this is because Talon actually did a pretty good job positioning themselves under the Biden administration. So they received a grant from the Department of Energy for $114 million in order to start developing their project. They had a partnership, I think they still have, a partnership with Tesla, with the goal of having the nickel that comes out of their mine go into metal processing and ultimately into EV batteries. So they had very much positioned themselves for this, what the Biden administration was hoping to do, which was to create a domestic mineral supply chain, and specifically around clean energy, right? Because these were for electric vehicles. I don't know where this goes going forward, because First of all, I can't figure out if this DOE grant will still go forward. I mean, what we're seeing with this administration is that they're withholding money even when grants have been approved. And so I can't tell if any of this money's flowing. They're certainly not talking about it publicly. So I'm not sure they'll continue to get that grant. Tesla as a partner has its own problems. It's a talk for another day. They probably aren't the most reliable business partner to Talon at the moment. And this administration seems to have a general predisposition towards just wanting to reverse whatever the last administration did, regardless of whether it was a good, bad, or indifferent idea. And so the fact that this mine had positioned itself fairly well under the Biden administration may be a liability at this point. In the meantime, this mine is quite close to the Mille Lacs, one of the 3 parts of the Mille Lacs reservation, and Mille Lacs has been running a water over nickel campaign to raise awareness about the risks of this mine. If you drive back and forth between the cities, you might have seen some of the water over nickel billboards. So this one's the murkiest. It's very hard to tell how they'll emerge from all of these political forces. Twin Metals is at this point has not received the blessing of this administration that PolyMet has. So they weren't listed on that fast track website. As folks probably know, there was a bill from Pete Stauber to renew or reinstate Twin Metals mineral leases, as well as reverse the 20-year moratorium on new federal mineral leases that the Trump administration had done in the Boundary Waters watershed. And this mine, of course, has been the football of the last, 16 years, right? The Obama administration declined to renew the leases for Twin Metals. Trump gave them back. Biden took them away, et cetera. Trump will probably give them back, but he has not done that at this point. Possibly because they were waiting to see if this bill would pass. That piece was part of the Stauber piece was part of the big, beautiful bill, so to speak. And because that was passed as a budget bill without the 60 votes that are needed to pass policy bills in the Senate, the Rules Committee, the Senate parliamentarian said, you can't do policy in this bill. You can only do budget items, and these mineral leases are policy. And so they had to take them out. That was not passed as part of the bill. Now we're probably back to the Trump administration just doing it through executive order. Executive orders, as I mentioned, have the force of law, but they are restricted by statutory authority. And so the litigation over this question has revolved around, what authority does the president have under the statutes passed by Congress? And that's an area where the courts are very comfortable. They do a lot of litigation lives in that space of, can the president do this based on what Congress said? And so that's likely to be the subject of this litigation going forward. I'm confident that if Trump attempts to reinstate these leases, that will go to court. Now, the leases in and of themselves are not a permit to mine, and they're not a right to mine. You still have to go through the state level processes, but it's still a significant issue for Twin Metals and for the future, because if they don't have the mineral leases, they definitely can't mine. Okay, last one is PolyMet. This one I think remains the front runner. It was the first one to get its permit in 2018. MCEA and others litigated those permits, as you know, and now the project is stalled. This one is the first one to actually show up in public mentions from this administration. They showed up on this fast tracking website. They are saying now that they're going to restart their processes very soon. We may see announcements as soon as August, actually. And they will be reapplying for the federal permit that they need, which is the federal wetlands permit. That alone does not allow them to mine, but it is a prerequisite. So we do expect to see significant movement from the PolyMet mine and its proposal in the next 18 months. MCEA as an organization, this has been our primary focus. And that's because as a legal organization, we think that the first sulfide mine to get its permit is very important in terms of the legal precedent that's set, right? I mentioned this is the first time we're interpreting our laws around sulfide mining. And so we want to make sure that the state is setting as high a standard as possible in this first mine, because if there are other mines that follow, they will follow that precedent and follow that standard. So we think that first one's really important. One big difference here from PolyMet between now and the last time. This is just a different mine or a different map that's kind of in a little bit closer. You can see PolyMet is the big pink square. You can see the Laurentian Divide. This time around, PolyMet is in a joint venture with a Canadian company called Teck. And so they actually, it's not just the pink site anymore. Now they have those yellow interests as well. And so we are expecting this time around PolyMet's proposal to be bigger because it's a result of this joint venture with Teck. It would cover all of those mineral interests, and also that it would span the Laurentian Divide, meaning that that mining proposal now threatens both the Boundary Waters watershed as well as the Lake Superior watershed. So that's a big difference that I think is worth watching and paying attention to. So this is a big moment for sulfide mining in Minnesota, and a big moment for all of us to stand together. This is the PolyMet mine site. It often gets referred to as like a brownfield site because they're using an old taconite processing facility, a tailings facility, but the mine site itself is pristine and quite beautiful. This is a picture of that area along the Partridge River. And remember, I told you, I was going to tell you, and I was going to tell you again. So here are my points again, and you can all remember them. The first one is that Minnesota gets to decide how our minerals are used, and we want to stand up for our rights. The second one is we want to recognize political rhetoric when we hear it. And the third one is we want to understand the limits of federal power. Mining companies will probably make a big push for our minerals in the next 12 to 24 months, buoyed by these executive orders, buoyed by the rhetoric within them. And we and other organizations will be calling on folks like you to contact the Walz administration, your legislators, commissioners, all of those folks. And so we'd love to have you stand with us. So thank you. Thanks for being here today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kathryn. We already had a question come in on Zoom, and it's just asking you, I mean, I guess I'll paraphrase it a little bit, but what do you think is the role for Governor Walz in this specifically? You've made it really clear that the state of Minnesota can do a lot, but what can Governor Walz do?
Yeah, so when a mining operation goes through the permitting process in Minnesota, they need between 18 and 20 permits. And some of those are fairly minimal, some are local, but some of those are really important. And the three big ones that I will mention are the Clean Water Act permit, the Clean Air Act permit, and the permit to mine. And those permits are issued by the DNR and they're issued by the PCA. And those people all work for Governor Walz. So Governor Walz has a say in whether those permits ultimately get granted and what kind of standards and requirements we put into those permits. And a decision like this one, I mean, we sometimes hear, we've heard this a little bit from Walz, we heard it a little bit from Dayton. They would say, well, you know, I let my commissioners decide. I don't get involved in that stuff. The reality is that, and I firmly believe this, like a decision as politically important as this one is absolutely something the governor is going to be aware of and can at a minimum choose to get involved in and probably will be involved in. So this is all of these permitting decisions are being made by his staff. And so he has a lot of power here.
Governor Walz will be involved. Can he veto them?
So yes, it doesn't work exactly like that, but his agencies can say no, and they can decline these permits. You know, this has been a kind of a controversial question, mostly within the DNR. I think there are folks who question, can the DNR say no to a mine? But the DNR does have standards in law. And the court has told them that the court has provided guidance on how to interpret that law through the decisions that we've litigated. And so here's a good example. One of the decisions that came out of the Polymet litigation, one of the issues I mentioned with sulfide mining is they're not good cleanup plans, right? You get hundreds of years of pollution at these sites. And so what DNR did, they have a rule that says you're supposed to, within 3 years after the mine closes, you're supposed to have restored the site to its original condition and have it be able to operate maintenance free. Meaning you're not running a wastewater treatment plant, you're not requiring people all the time doing things in order to prevent pollution, right? It's a walk away situation within 3 years. That's what our rules say. And then the language says 3 years or longer if the DNR commissioner decides. Okay, so there's some discretion here, right? Maybe it takes 5 years or 7 years. Well, what DNR did when they wrote the Polymet permit is they said, well, we'll just let the mining company operate, and the state probably operate a wastewater treatment plant forever. And the court said, well, wait a second. The statute says you have to have it, or the rule says you have to have an end date, right? Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's a little longer if the DNR lets you, but what is the end date? And I was there in court on the day that a Minnesota Supreme Court justice asked DNR's attorney, well, how long are you going to need before you can meet the statutory requirement of this law and bring this back to its original condition? And the DNR attorney said, as long as it takes. The court did not find that to be satisfactory. So let's say a mining company applies for a permit and they're not able to identify a closing walkaway scenario, and they're not able to identify a timeline. My interpretation is what the court has clearly said is that mine does not meet the requirements of our permit to mine laws, and DNR cannot issue that permit. And so we have circumstances where the agencies are clearly being told, if a mine doesn't meet the requirements, you can't issue that permit. And to me, that means the agencies can say no. And to me, that means Governor Walz could say no.
Are there places in the world where these same minerals can be mined, not using a sulfuric acid type process, or in a less damaging environmental way?
It's a good question. One of the big problems we have here in Minnesota is the sheer quantity of water, right? It's all connected. Groundwater, surface water, it flows everywhere. And so one of the challenges that mining companies face is managing all of that water. And so when you're talking about, I mentioned that wastewater treatment plant that would run forever under Polymet's proposal. That wastewater treatment plant, it's not great to run a wastewater treatment plant forever, but also it's not actually clear that the wastewater treatment plant using the treatment they want to use can treat that volume of water, because it is so much water here in Minnesota because it's, because it's both the precipitation and the groundwater and so forth. And so other parts of the world don't have that issue, right? So we have some of these copper nickel mines in the Southwest, and the management strategies are different because you're not dealing with, constant snow and rain, right? These are in many cases fairly close to desert environments. And so you don't have that problem. We still don't have good examples, though, of those mines not causing problems. And there are absolutely problems that there's mines in Arizona and in the Southwest. So I guess I would hesitate to say that they don't have the problems at all, but I definitely would say they have different problems. The one thing I want to say about this is I think this is a valid question, and I hear it a lot. Like, is there somewhere we can do this that's safe? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody does, because we don't have these good examples. What I want to say is that much of the idea that we need these minerals is based on projections of what mineral demand might look like over the next 20 or 30 or 50 years. And you've all seen these projections, right, of like copper demand going through the roof, nickel, palladium, right? And a lot of this is driven actually by clean energy, although not all of it. Nickel, for example, most of it actually goes into stainless steel, not into EV batteries. Similar with copper. A lot of this stuff is going other places besides clean energy. But, you see these projections, okay? Those projections are based on assumptions, right? And honestly, like anybody can make a projection, right? You take a trend line and you extend it out forever. Technology changes, costs change, situations change. And so when I think of those projections, I think, well, what are the things we can do first that are least harmful in order to start to fulfill some of that mineral demand, knowing that some of that mineral demand is probably not going to play out the way the projections say, right? So for example, we are recycling 30% of our copper in the United States. Europe recycles 60%. So long before we dig a new hole in the ground anywhere in the world, why wouldn't we be looking at our recycling rates? So the recycling is an easy one. Another one is material substitution. One of the challenges that Talon faces is that nickel is being quickly phased out of EV batteries. And that's because nickel is hard to get, it's expensive, and it's environmentally harmful. And so the companies have said, hey, let's invest in research and development to figure out other ways to build EV batteries. And so nickel demand is actually probably going to evaporate in the relative near future. And so we see material substitution for less environmentally harmful or other materials. So we have these other options to explore long before we get to the question of where can we mine safely? Like in a supportive way, that's the question the mining companies want you to ask, right? They want you to say, well, we have to mine. We're going to mine here or we're going to mine somewhere else or do it worse, right? That's their argument. I think it's okay for us to question the assumptions of that and say, well, do we have to mine? Let's make sure we have other options on the table before we start digging those other holes.
An unrelated question, how do you communicate or advocate with the state or federal rep who actively supports these mines?
Persistently. I mean, that is hard, absolutely. And I think that, there are strategies. I mean, the Braver Angels group, there are strategies for talking to folks you don't agree with. It's unlikely that that rep is going to give you the time to deploy any of those strategies, right? They're probably going to be pretty dismissive. That said, I do think that regular contacts from the public make public officials a lot more uncomfortable than they sometimes pretend, right? I mean, you would be shocked. Public officials, elected officials that we talk to, if they get, 7, 8, 10 calls on an issue, to them, that is a flood of public participation, right? Because not that many people pick up the phone and call. And so even though it may feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, and I have no doubt that it probably does at times, you can't know from the outside looking in the impact that you're having. And so even though it's frustrating, I would encourage you to keep it up. And know that as well, there'll be the opportunity to talk to state officials in the near future, and many of them might be a little bit more receptive to your message.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to our state Senator Grant Hostap, because we talked until we're blue in the face now, and he just fully believes that he would not get reelected if he were in favor of our cause. And I don't know, maybe he really thinks that we have to wait for the science. That's his thing. So should we, you may not be the person to ask, but do you think we should try to look for somebody new, or because really voted?
I unfortunately am not the person to ask. MCEA is a 501c3 organization that does not engage in electioneering. I am sorry.
Hi, Kathryn. I'm wondering if you could just very briefly give your take on the recent announcement of 50% tariff on copper, and whether you see that as helping or hindering any of these mine projects.
I don't, honestly, it's a little hard to see how it would affect it either way. The short-term efforts to change the copper market or change the markets for minerals is a little bit, or really a lot, attenuated from the question of whether any particular mine goes forward. I mean, building a mine in the United States takes on average 16 years from discovery to permitting. We're actually one of the faster countries in the world. I think China maybe goes a little faster, but you see a bunch of South American countries that are, well above 20. These mining companies are playing the long game. They're not actually that interested in what copper prices are today. Most of the time, they're looking out projections over, multiple years. And they also know that just because external markets change, it's probably not going to change the situation on the ground in terms of what's actually required to move their mine forward. And so I think all that you've done is created what these tariffs are doing generally, which is a lot of havoc for a lot of people and businesses, and some unpredictability in the market. But it's not something that can practically change the fate of any particular mine, because the political processes and the legal processes are on just a different timeline than today's tariffs.
Great presentation. Have you seen the mining companies substantially increase their level of activity and investment? Trump came in, and is it to a level that they sense something is imminent? They're playing a hand. So have they substantially increased the investment?
I would say yes, for sure, with Polymatch or New Range. They definitely see an opening. And I think they have positioned themselves with this administration as sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, the victims or something, to say, well, look, we got our permits and we were so close. And now, we have these setbacks. And so we have seen them step up in terms of like political presence, number of lobbyists, campaigns, as well as regulatory staff, or staff within the mining company whose job is to move permitting processes forward. So for sure they are. I think it's a lot less clear with Talon and Twin Metals. Twin Metals, I think in particular, you see their public statements where they're still in kind of a long game situation. They're not necessarily, you can't build a mine in 4 years, right? I mentioned these timelines. And so I think it's less clear to them that they'll benefit. And frankly, it might be less clear to them that it will benefit them to play into some of this political rhetoric. So I think they're laying a little bit more low. I don't know, though, just to be fully transparent, I don't know what internal investments they're making to increase staff. There may be some of that going on, but their external presence is still fairly quiet. Whereas I think Polymat's really seen themselves going out front. If you look at the other mines listed on that fast tracking list, you will see other mines that are trying to move quickly around the United States. So the Hermosa mine, for example, in Arizona is one that you see them, they think they've got an opening, right? They think we can go through this environmental review process quickly, we can get through fairly quickly, and we might have a mine in the next 4 years. But it's also important to keep in mind that Arizona's state laws are much less robust than Minnesota. And so they're seeing fewer, state level political barriers.
And now for our penultimate question, we have one online. Mr.
Thank you. I appreciated your photo of that half the drainage out on Spruce Road, because I saw that site when it looked just like your PowerPoint there. And then I went out there a few months later. Somebody had come in and pushed a bunch of gravel and brush on top. So instead of a cleanup, we got a cover up. I think we should
not a fix.
We should assume that's what we're going to see from mining.
I will say on my way to the final question that our friend and neighbor Chuck Breen is our presenter next week. And I'm very excited. His PowerPoint is called Bible Battle. You'll have to wait for the email to get the details. You can just start getting it now. Online, there was a question that is asking if you could elaborate on the claims of benefits for Minnesota that the mining companies use when asking Minnesota leaders to support the sulfide mining operations versus the actual benefits that might be observed for us.
Yeah, and so this is actually a really interesting question, because this is one that's changed over the years since I've worked on this issue. I started working on this in 2010, and the universal message in the mining company was jobs, 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 right? We used to have a robust iron or taconite industry on the range. It doesn't employ people the way it did, and that the sulfide mines, are the hope to bring those jobs back. And I will say at least since 2018 to 2020, and for sure since Biden was elected, we see that rhetoric fade. You don't always see it fade from the advocates, but if you listen carefully to the mining companies themselves, they talk a lot less about this. And, based on some of my, kind of quiet conversations with folks, I do think they are increasingly aware of the limitations of that argument, because mining over time has just become a more capital intensive process. And, economics 101, right? A more capital intensive process means a less labor intensive process. And the jobs that they have may be remote, right? Some of these trucks are driven remotely and could be, driven from anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be a Minnesota job. And we've really seen that argument fade. And we've seen the rise of the clean energy and climate talking points since 2020. And again, when analyzing the political salience, this was around the same time that, that we see the trifecta come into the DFL in Minnesota, and we see legislature that was very set on acting on climate. And they passed the 2040 clean energy bill. This is a bill that requires that Minnesota have 100% carbon-free energy by 2040. And so you see them kind of seizing that moment. Now, when you look at that, the benefits for Minnesota become a little bit more challenging, right? Because the way that most of these mines are set up right now, you mine the minerals and you set them on the global market. It's hard to draw a line between any of that and a particular clean energy development here in Minnesota. But that's the general argument, and sort of a moral argument of if we're going to have clean energy, we might as well mine it here, kind of idea, sort of a moral obligation argument. And so the benefits are attenuated in terms of specific examples, but they're tying it to the state goal that we have. And now we see, the rise of the national security and technology dominance arguments, saying that we need these for, for fighter jets and for our military technology. It's worth noting, by the way, that a lot of the military technology you've been reading about in the paper is rare earth elements, which is not what we're mining here. Regardless, this is what that connection is, and as well as, the need for data centers and for more AI, and we have to win the AI race with China, et cetera. And again, because we're into these big policy arguments and not the local economic argument, the line is harder to draw. What's the relationship between a Minnesota mine and whether or not we win in a race for AI dominance, if that's a thing you think we should win, right? How do you draw that? I can't do it, and so it becomes a little bit abstract and harder to find those benefits for the state.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for bringing your insight to this.